You hear footsteps in the corridor outside, but they never stop at your door. Your fingers trace patterns in the dust on the windowsill circles and lines that mean nothing to anyone but you. Through the narrow opening, you can see the gardens where other children play, their laughter floating up like music from another world. You press your face against the cold glass, breath fogging the view, and for a moment you wonder if you're the one who's real or if they are. Time moves differently when no one marks your birthdays, when your name appears in no family Bibles, when the portrait painter was dismissed before he could capture your face. You are 7, or maybe 8, and you are learning that some kinds of existence don't count as living. I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching this from right now? It amazes me how a story this painful, buried this deep, can reach across centuries and oceans to connect us all in this moment. This is England in 1909, and the child at that window is Prince John, youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. But this story doesn't begin or end with him. For centuries, across every royal house in Europe, children were born whose very existence threatened the careful fiction that blue blood meant superior blood. They came into the world with almond-shaped eyes, distinctive facial features, and hearts that beat differently than expected, what we now understand as Down syndrome, a chromosomal variation occurring randomly in roughly 1 of every 700 births. But in the gilded palaces of divine right monarchies, where every prince and princess served as living proof of genetic superiority, these children became something dangerous. Evidence that royal bloodlines were as vulnerable to nature's variations as any peasant family. The response was as predictable as it was brutal. Hide them, silence them, erase them, make them disappear so thoroughly that even their names would vanish from official records, scratched out like mistakes in a ledger, as if a human life could be corrected with a pen stroke and enough money to ensure discretion. Prince John's fate was gentler than most, which tells you everything about how dark this history becomes. For his first 4 years, he appeared in family photographs, dressed in sailor suits beside his siblings. But around 1909, something changed. The seizures began epilepsy that would plague him for the rest of his short life. And with the seizures came other signs that palace physicians quietly documented: developmental delays, learning difficulties, features that photographs from the era reveal but that no one dared name aloud. By 1910, John had vanished from public view entirely, not dead that would require explanation, ceremony, a grave that curious eyes might find. Instead, he was relocated to Wood Farm, a modest house on the family's Sandringham estate, placed in the care of his devoted nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, visited occasionally, writing in her diary about poor little Johnny living in his own world. His siblings were discouraged from visiting. His parents maintained careful distance, viewing him through the lens of royal duty rather than parental love. John spent his days collecting acorns, watching the gardener work, laughing at games only he understood. Lala kept every drawing he made, every photograph, every small treasure he collected, an archive of love that contradicted the official narrative of tragic burden. When John died in 1919 at age 13, following a severe seizure, Queen Mary wrote to a friend that his death was a great release and the greatest mercy for his poor little soul. Those words, release, mercy, echo through centuries of royal correspondence about such children. They reveal a worldview where difference equaled suffering, where inability to fulfill dynastic duty meant a life wasn't worth living. But between the clinical phrases, you can sometimes glimpse the human cost. Lala Bill kept John's drawings until her own death, carrying memories of a boy who loved music and animals, who found joy in simple things, whose life mattered even if his family couldn't acknowledge it. Travel backward to France in 1640, where whispers spread through the palace of Fontainebleau about a child born to King Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, a child who appeared before the future Sun King. Court records, carefully sanitized, mention only a weak infant who failed to thrive. But private letters between royal physicians, discovered centuries later in the Vatican secret archives, describe features we now recognize: the flat nasal bridge, the single palmar crease, the protruding tongue that marked Down syndrome. This unnamed prince lived exactly 43 days. His wet nurse was interrogated repeatedly, as if proper feeding could have prevented what was written in his chromosomes. In an era where infant death required blame, where royal blood was supposed to be stronger than common stock, someone had to be at fault. Palace servants whispered about the special prayers Anne of Austria commissioned, the pilgrimages she made seeking explanation for why God had marked her child. Some said it was punishment for the king's sins. Others blamed the queen's Spanish blood. What no one said, what no one dared suggest, was that sometimes nature simply creates variation, that this child was not punishment or curse, but simply different. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty dealt with their own hidden shame. While history remembers Alexei's hemophilia, few know about Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna's youngest daughter, born in 1882. Her name appears in no official genealogies, mentioned only as an infant daughter died young, if at all. But payroll records from the Alexander Palace show continuous payments to a specific set of servants assigned to the East Wing nursery for 16 years after her birth, long after an infant death would require such attention. Letters between ladies-in-waiting describe a girl who never learned to speak properly, who at 14 still played with dolls meant for toddlers, who had to be watched constantly lest she wander into the frozen gardens in her nightgown, laughing at snowflakes. When revolution came in 1917, this forgotten Grand Duchess simply vanished from history. Did revolutionary soldiers find her in that East Wing nursery, a woman child who couldn't understand why everyone was screaming? Did a servant spirit her away to some remote village where a simple-minded woman who loved dolls might live unnoticed? Or did the family themselves, fleeing for their lives, make a calculated decision about who could and couldn't be saved? Revolution has a way of erasing inconvenient truths along with the regimes that created them. Spain's Habsburg line, already infamous for inbreeding, produced numerous children with various disabilities. Charles II, El Hechizado. The bewitched is well documented, his Habsburg jaw so pronounced he could barely chew. But Charles had siblings and cousins who never made it into official portraits, never received names or titles. Spanish court physicians, writing in encoded Latin they hoped would outlive them, documented infants born with Mongol features terminology that wouldn't become formally medical for another 2 centuries. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, writing in 1693, described examining a princess whose name was literally scratched from the record. He noted her small stature, her difficulty swallowing, her profound developmental delays, but also something else: her extraordinary affection, her desire to embrace everyone she met, her pure joy at music and dancing, even if she couldn't keep rhythm. Zapata suggested, carefully, that perhaps these children were not cursed, but simply examples of God's mysterious variety. He was ultimately investigated by the Inquisition. His notes, hidden in a false bottom of a medical text, weren't discovered until 1954. In the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Mehmed III, who ruled from 1595 to 1603, reportedly had a son born with distinctive features and developmental delays. Ottoman succession laws were brutal princes fought to the death for the throne, and any sign of weakness meant certain elimination. This unnamed prince didn't die in infancy, as records claim. Instead, he was sent to the cafes, the cage, a luxurious prison within Topkapi Palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation. Eunuch records show food and supplies delivered to a specific room in the cafes for 23 years after this prince's supposed death. Guards reported strange sounds, not the usual protests or plotting of imprisoned princes, but singing, the same songs over and over, and laughter at odd hours. When Sultan Ahmed IV died in 1617 and succession chaos erupted, Every room in the cafes was open to account for all potential heirs. One room, according to a guard's memoir written decades later, contained an adult man with the mind of a child, surrounded by thousands of pieces of colored glass arranged in intricate patterns on the floor. He had spent 2 decades creating art no one would ever see, humming songs no one would ever hear, living a life no one would ever acknowledge. What happened to him in that moment of discovery? Records cease. Silence falls. Another ghost in the palace walls. Bavaria's Wittelsbach dynasty left more traces. Princess Alexandra, born in 1826 to King Ludwig III, was kept at Nymphenburg Palace in what servants called the Quiet Wing. Official biographies claim she died at age 3, but household accounts show expenses for her care until 1851. A governess's diary, donated to the Bavarian State Library in 1923, describes teaching a 25-year-old woman basic tasks: how to dress herself, how to use a spoon properly, how to recognize letters, though she'd never form words. This governess wrote with unexpected tenderness about Alexandra's love for her pet canaries, how she would sit for hours listening to them sing, perfectly content in a world that required nothing more from her than existence. Yet even this relative kindness came with conditions. Alexandra could live, but she couldn't be seen. She could exist, but not as a princess, not as a person whose name appeared in any succession documents. When she finally died, her body was quietly interred in an unmarked section of the royal crypt. No ceremony, no announcement, as if 25 years of life could be erased by simply pretending they never happened. Denmark's royal family employed a different strategy with Prince Gustav, born in 1803 to Frederick II. Rather than hide him completely, they created an elaborate fiction. Gustav, they claimed, suffered from a nervous condition that required constant travel for his health. In reality, he was moved between remote royal properties every few months, never staying long enough for local populations to notice his differences. His tutors, really minders, submitted false reports about his progress in studies while actually teaching him basic life skills. Letters from these tutors, preserved in the Danish royal archives, reveal their struggle to maintain the charade while developing genuine affection for their charge. One tutor, Hans Eriksson, wrote extensively about Gustav's unique abilities: his perfect recall of every person he'd ever met, his ability to predict weather changes days in advance, his strange gift for knowing when someone was lying. Perhaps, Eriksson wrote, we measure intelligence too narrowly. The prince understands things I do not, sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who truly has the deficit, him or those of us who cannot enter his world? But Eriksson's progressive thinking found no support in the Danish court. When Gustav died at age 31 officially of pneumonia, but likely from a heart condition common in Down syndrome, his death was announced as occurring in Italy during one of his health treatments. His body was returned to Denmark at night, buried before dawn, his entire existence compressed into a single line in the royal genealogy. Prince Gustav, 1803-1834. Austria-Hungary's Habsburg curse of inbreeding produced numerous children with disabilities. Emperor Franz Joseph's brother, Archduke Karl Ludwig, had a son in 1868 who was immediately declared stillborn. But a midwife's diary, discovered during World War II when her descendants fled bombing, tells a different story. The child lived, she wrote, but with features that made the emperor himself recoil. Within hours of birth, the infant was taken from his mother, who was told he had died. The midwife was sworn to secrecy, paid handsomely, and warned that breaking her oath meant death. Years later, this same midwife was called to a monastery outside Vienna to treat a sick child and recognized him immediately. The monks, she learned, had been paid to raise him as an orphan, never knowing his true identity. They called him Felix, meaning happy, because despite his limitations, he radiated joy. He lived among them for 12 years, helping with simple tasks, beloved by the brothers who saw in his innocence a kind of holiness. When he died of scarlet fever in 1880, the entire monastery mourned. The abbot, noting his death in the monastery records, wrote, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." These patterns repeat across centuries and dynasties with depressing consistency. Birth, recognition of difference, concealment, erasure, royal blood that wasn't royal enough, divine right undermined by human variation. Yet the very qualities that made these children threatening to royal power structures their unconditional love, their joy in simple things, their freedom from the pretensions and competitions that tormented their normal siblings. These were the qualities that occasionally broke through the official cruelty. Servants who risked everything to show kindness, nurses who kept photographs and drawings, monks and nuns who saw holiness where others saw only shame. Even some royal parents who, despite the crushing pressures of their positions, found ways to ensure their hidden children received some measure of care and comfort. But these moments of mercy only highlight the broader tragedy. What was lost when these children were erased? Not just their individual lives, though those mattered immensely, but what was lost to their families, their nations, their eras, the empathy that siblings might have developed, the humility that royal houses so desperately needed, the understanding that genetic variation is nature's rule, not its exception. World War II marked a turning point, though not always for the better. The Nazis' systematic murder of disabled individuals, including those with Down syndrome, shocked even royal families who had hidden such children for centuries. Some recognized their own complicity in creating the attitudes that made such genocide possible. Princess Alexandra of Prussia, born in 1915, was quietly moved to Switzerland when the euthanasia programs began, living there under an assumed name until her death in 1980, having outlived the empire she was born to inherit. By the 1960s and 1970s, medical advances meant children with Down syndrome were living longer, healthier lives. Royal families could no longer claim such children inevitably died in infancy. When Prince John of Luxembourg was born in 1957 with Down syndrome, his family made a revolutionary decision. They acknowledged him. Not fully, not proudly, but they admitted he existed, that he lived in a special care facility, that he was their son and brother. It was a crack in centuries of absolute denial. Spain's modern royal family broke entirely with tradition in 1973 when they publicly acknowledged that King Juan Carlos's nephew had been born with Down syndrome. The child appeared in family photographs, attended certain public events, was spoken of with affection rather than shame. It was revolutionary, and it highlighted how recently such basic human recognition had been denied. Today, we know that Down syndrome is simply a genetic variation occurring randomly across all populations, all social classes, all bloodlines. We know that individuals with Down syndrome can live full, meaningful lives, that they experience the same range of emotions as anyone else, that their intellectual disabilities don't diminish their humanity. We know this now, but for centuries, royal families who claimed divine appointment, who justified their power through supposed genetic superiority, couldn't afford to know this. Every hidden child represented a crack in the foundation of divine right. Every erased name undermined the myth of superior blood. Modern royal families still face these challenges, though typically with more compassion. When rumors surface about a royal child with disabilities, palace PR teams issue careful statements about privacy. Support is provided, care is arranged, but full integration into royal life remains rare. Old habits die hard. Researching these stories reveals an archive of absence-erased names, destroyed records, unmarked graves. For every royal child with Down syndrome we know of, how many vanished without trace, hidden by servants' silence? The tragedy lies not just in secrecy, but in what it cost. Parents who turned love to shame, siblings taught superiority, children denied sunlight and care. Imagine Prince John at Wood Farm, tracing fogged glass, humming unseen melodies, arranging his acorns in private order. When Lala Bill enters with breakfast, she smiles, speaks, and truly sees him one small act of recognition in a world built on denial. When he dies at 13, she mourns not what he might have been, but who he was, a boy who loved music, laughed freely, and gave affection without measure. Across Europe in unmarked graves lie princes and princesses erased for being different, forgotten children of royal blood. They lived and died human, despite every denial. Their silence still condemns a world where lineage outweighs love, and fear of imperfection births true monstrosity. They linger in shadows and song, watching a world that will not see them, waiting for footsteps that will never come.